My daughter handed gifts to everyone but me at Christmas dinner. She didn't know I owned her life. Dad doesn't need anything. Besides, he doesn't contribute anything. My daughter Clara's words echoed across the lavish Christmas dinner I sponsored. Felt like a public death sentence. There was a dead silence. Everyone looked away, suddenly finding their own shoes strangely interesting. Just minutes earlier, she stood up and raised a glass to her husband Marcus, praising him as the pillar and provider of her dream life. The gift she'd given him, a $50,000 Patek Philippe watch, had been purchased with the monthly allowance I'd secretly sent her. Her husband, who'd just been promoted thanks to a contract I'd secretly pushed on him, had opened a bottle of 2 5-year-old Macallan, another gift from me, and raised a glass to men who make it all happen. There I stood, in my old suit and driving my old Volvo, a ghost in my own empire, the secret founder and CEO of it all. And I realized, in trying to protect my daughter from the world, I had created a monster that knew no gratitude. That night, as dawn began to break, I made a decision. Love is not always unconditional provision. Sometimes, love is a painful but necessary lesson, and their lesson was about to begin. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you and where are you listening? The old Volvo hummed a familiar, comforting tune as it coasted into the sprawling underground garage of the Vance Logistics headquarters. Arthur guided the car, a relic from a different era of his life, into a spot far from the gleaming Teslas and imported German sedans clustered near the elevators. To any observer, he was just another mid-level manager arriving for the annual Christmas party, a ghost in a machine of his own making. The new security guard at the entrance, a young man with a crisp uniform and an earnest expression, didn't recognize him, and that was precisely how Arthur wanted it. He presented his old employee ID, the one that listed him as a senior advisor, and smiled patiently as the guard scanned it. "Enjoy the party, sir," the young man said, handing back the card. Arthur nodded. "I plan to." He stepped into the main lobby, and the breath caught in his throat, a familiar pang of quiet pride. The space was a cathedral of modern commerce, all glass and steel, with ceilings that soared 3 stories high. An indoor waterfall, a concession to his late wife Eleanor, cascaded down a wall of polished black granite, its gentle roar a counterpoint to the festive buzz of conversation. Near the entrance stood a Christmas tree so tall its star-dusted top nearly brushed the second-floor balcony. It was ostentatious, perhaps, but it was his. He had built this, every gleaming floor, every invisible being. It was a kingdom forged from late nights and risky decisions, a testament to a life spent in the pursuit of something grand. He lingered at the edge of the crowd, a shadow observing his own creation. The air was thick with the scent of pine, expensive perfume, and the simmering energy of a year's success. He saw pockets of employees laughing, their faces flushed with champagne, and felt a warmth spread through his chest. This was a culture he'd fostered, one of hard work rewarded with genuine celebration. Across the room, he spotted David Chen, the company's official chairman, and the only other person in the building who knew the full truth. David, ever discreet, met his gaze for a fraction of a second and gave a nearly imperceptible nod before turning back to his conversation. That was their pact. For the past 5 years, since Eleanor's death had hollowed out his ambition for public life, Arthur had retreated. He became a ghost, a myth whispered about in the boardroom, the retired founder who communicated only through David. The company was private, a tightly held ship, which made it easier to stand on his own deck, unrecognized. That quiet pride began to curdle when he saw his son-in-law, Marcus, holding court near the waterfall. Marcus was handsome, charismatic, and radiated the kind of slick confidence that Arthur had always found unsettling. In his hand, he held a bottle of 2 5-year-old Macallan, its dark amber liquid glowing under the recessed lighting. A ripple of insecurity, cold and unwelcome, washed over Arthur. He had sent that bottle to Marcus's office the previous week, a silent congratulations for closing the Apex contract. The gift had been anonymous, a quiet nod from a father-in-law, nothing more. Marcus, with the flourish of a magician, uncorked the bottle and began pouring generous measures for a circle of young, eager executives. They stood there in the heart of the building Arthur had bled for and hung on Marcus's every word. "A toast," Marcus announced, his voice ringing with theatrical self-importance as he raised his glass, "to a successful year, to the men who did it all themselves, without relying on anyone." "And I.R.N." The young men murmured their approval, clinking their glasses against his. One of them, a bright kid from acquisitions, eyed the bottle with reverence. "This is a good bottle, Marcus. Did the boss give it to you?" A smirk played on Marcus's lips. It was a small, fleeting expression, but to Arthur, it was as loud as a gunshot. "Please," Marcus scoffed, a note of condescension in his tone. "I'm not waiting for anyone to give me a gift. This is the result of closing the Apex contract. I'm giving it to myself." Arthur stood frozen near the giant Christmas tree, the festive baubles suddenly seeming garish and absurd. "I watched my son-in-law open a $3,000 bottle of whiskey, a gift from me, and toast to self-made men, without even glancing in my direction. That Apex contract." I silently pushed it toward his desk. He had seen the potential in the deal long before Marcus had, and had instructed David to subtly guide the opportunity into his son-in-law's portfolio. It was meant to be a test, a chance for Marcus to prove he was more than just a charming facade. Instead, he had turned Arthur's provision into a monument to his own ego. Just then, his daughter, Clara, materialized at his side. She was beautiful, dressed in a shimmering silver dress that probably cost more than the Volvo he drove. But as she hugged him, her embrace felt hollow, a performance for Marcus's colleagues who were now watching them. It was a loose, perfunctory gesture, over in a second. "Dad," she said, her eyes already darting back to her husband. "Did you think Marcus was great? He was the star of the night." There was no warmth in her question, no genuine curiosity about his evening. It was a test of her own, a demand for validation. A coldness settled over him, the sharp, biting chill of being utterly underestimated by his own flesh and blood. He looked at his daughter, so captivated by the superficial gleam of her husband's success, and felt a vague bitterness begin to bloom in the space where his pride had been. They were products of a material world whose origins they refused to understand, or perhaps simply didn't care to. He had given them everything, and in doing so, he had perhaps made it impossible for them to see the giver. Was this his mistake? Had his retreat into the shadows allowed a monster of ingratitude to grow in his place? Their laughter echoed in the room I had built. It was the sound of people celebrating on the ship, completely unaware that the captain was standing right next to them, silently watching the icebergs. The orchestrated chaos of the party began to coalesce as dinner wound down and the formal speeches concluded. A sense of anticipation settled over the VIP table where Arthur was seated, a circular island in the sea of celebration, softly illuminated by the stage lights. He was placed strategically across from Marcus and Clara, a satellite in his own solar system. For a fleeting moment, a foolish, fatherly hope flickered within him. Perhaps the whiskey incident was a fluke, a young man's momentary lapse in judgment. He watched his daughter, her face aglow, and felt the old, familiar pull of love, a current that refused to be silenced by disappointment. Then Clara stood up. The movement was fluid and practiced, designed to draw the eye. A hush fell over their table, the clinking of glasses and murmur of conversation momentarily ceasing. She held a small, square box wrapped in the unmistakable robin's egg blue of Tiffany & Co. She held it not like a gift, but like a prop. "I just want to say something," she began, her voice a sweet, melodious chime that carried easily in the manufactured quiet. She turned her beaming smile, a brilliant, high-wattage thing, directly on her husband. "I have a little gift for my wonderful husband." She paused, letting the moment hang in the air, a master of her small stage. "Thank you, Marcus, for working so hard to give us the life I've always dreamed of. You're my rock, my provider." The words struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. My provider. He felt the air leave his lungs. He looked at his daughter, her eyes shining with what looked like adoration, and saw a stranger. The life she dreamed of, the life she was living, was financed down to the last designer shoe by a monthly allowance that discreetly appeared in her bank account, an allowance he had set up years ago, ensuring she would never want for anything. Marcus, basking in the glow of her praise, opened the velvet box. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a Patek Philippe watch. It was a beautiful, obscenely expensive timepiece, its face a universe of intricate gears and polished gold. He held it up for everyone to see, a trophy from a victory he hadn't earned. Polite, enthusiastic applause rippled around the table. Marcus slipped the watch onto his wrist, angling it so it would catch the light, a perfect accessory for the self-made man. She admired the watch. Arthur thought, a cold knot forming in his stomach, which the allowance I sent her had paid for. "You are my provider," she said, and the words were like a knife to my chest. As the applause died down, an awkward, expectant silence descended. Every eye at the table flickered from the triumphant couple to Arthur. It was the natural next beat in the rhythm of family etiquette. A word for her father, a small gift, a token, even just a nod of acknowledgement. The silence stretched, becoming thin and taut. Arthur could feel the weight of their collective gaze, the social pressure mounting with each passing second. He saw the polite, fixed smiles on the faces of the other executives, the unspoken question hanging over them all. Clara, however, seemed oblivious. Or worse, she was reveling in it. After fastening the clasp of the new watch on Marcus's wrist and giving his hand a final, performative squeeze, she turned away from Arthur completely. She leaned toward a friend sitting beside her, a woman with sharp, inquisitive eyes, and broke the silence with a light, airy laugh, as if sharing a private joke. The friend, perhaps sensing the excruciating awkwardness of the moment, leaned in and whispered, though her voice carried across the silent table with perfect clarity, "Don't you have anything for your father?" Clara giggled, a sound that was suddenly sharp and ugly. She waved a dismissive hand in Arthur's direction, not even bothering to look at him. "Oh, that old man doesn't get anything," she said, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that was far more shocking than outright anger. "My dad doesn't need anything. Besides, he doesn't contribute anything." A heavy silence fell. It was no longer expectant. It was stunned. It was a vacuum sucking the air and warmth out of the space. Even his daughter's friends felt the brutal impact of the words. They suddenly found their shoes strangely interesting, their wine glasses requiring intense study. The casual dismissal, the public verdict of his worthlessness, hung in the air like poison. It wasn't a statement, it was a verdict. In that moment, something inside Arthur shifted. The deep, aching hurt of a father being erased by his child receded, and in its place, a cold, calm anger began to rise. It was an emotion he recognized well, the dispassionate fury of the boardroom, the icy resolve that had built his empire. The pain was still there, a low thrum beneath the surface, but it was no longer in control. He stopped thinking like a father. He started thinking like a competitor. When my daughter made a joke about how that old man got nothing, an awkward silence suddenly fell over the table. I saw David Chen's eyes from across the room. He didn't have to say anything. We both knew a line had just been crossed. The drive home was a study in silence. The familiar hum of the Volvo's engine, usually a comfort, did little to fill the cavernous quiet left by the party's cacophony. Clara's words echoed in the space where the radio should have been playing, each syllable a tiny, sharp-edged stone thrown against glass. He doesn't contribute anything. The phrase looped, relentless, and unforgiving. He had felt the public sting of it at the table, a hot flush of humiliation. Now, alone in the dark, it settled into something deeper, a cold, heavy ache of loneliness that seemed to emanate from the empty passenger seat beside him. He bypassed the grand staircase and the darkened living room, his footsteps silent on the marble floors of the house that felt more like a museum than a home these days. His destination was his office, a sanctuary of walnut-paneled walls, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and the faint, pleasant scent of old leather and paper. It was the one room that was still truly his. He didn't turn on the main lights, allowing only the soft glow from a desk lamp to push back the shadows. On the corner of the vast mahogany desk, In a simple silver frame was a photograph of Eleanor. She was smiling, her eyes crinkling at the corners, captured in a moment of pure, unburdened joy in the garden just outside the window. He ran a thumb over the cool glass, the bitterness of the evening rising in his throat. He had made a promise to her in the final, hushed days of her life. Protect our girl Arthur. Give her the world, but don't let the world break her. He had tried. He thought shielding her from the truth of his work, from the pressures and the sleepless nights, was a form of protection. He'd wanted to give her a normal life, one unburdened by the colossal weight of the Vance name. He sank into his leather chair, the cool material a stark contrast to the heat of his thoughts. His gaze drifted past the photograph to the framed documents on the wall, the original articles of incorporation for his father-in-law's company, a relic from a bygone era. He remembered the day he'd taken it over, not as an inheritance, but as a salvage operation. Eleanor's father had been a good man but a terrible businessman, and the company was a sinking ship riddled with debt and mismanagement. Arthur had spent the next 20 years rebuilding it from the ashes. In secret, he worked 18-hour days, mortgaged their home twice, and poured every ounce of his energy into dragging it back from the brink and forging it into the quiet empire it was today. He'd done it for Eleanor, and then for Clara. A specific memory, sharp and unwelcome, surfaced. It was from a few months ago, at a dinner Clara had insisted upon at a ridiculously overwrought 3-star Michelin restaurant. The meal itself cost more than most people's monthly rent, a fact that seemed to be lost on her. You know, she had said, pushing a minuscule portion of foam around her plate with a silver fork, sometimes I feel embarrassed. My friends' husbands are all vice presidents at large corporations. Marcus is brilliant, but he has to fight his way through a mid-sized company. He remembered the burn of those words, the sheer, breathtaking ignorance of them. That mid-sized company, he had thought, is paying for this $2,000 meal. It's paying for your penthouse. It's the empire your grandfather nearly destroyed and has spent 20 years rebuilding. But he has swallowed the retort, offering a placating, fatherly smile instead. Marcus is a smart guy, he'd said, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. He'll succeed. Clara had sighed, a sound of profound, unearned weariness. I know, but it would be so much easier if our family actually had something, instead of just living off what's left of Grandpa's old trust fund. That had been the moment. That was one of the many small cuts, the gradual poisoning of the well. He was a frog in boiling water, and the party had been the final, scalding bubble that broke the surface. He saw it all, now with a painful, crystalline clarity. The constant need for more, the lack of empathy, the casual materialism, it had been there all along. He had mistaken it for youthful ambition, for the normal desires of a child who had never known want. He had been wrong. In his desperate attempt to protect her from the world, he had created a person who could not see beyond her own reflection. He had failed his promise to Eleanor, not by giving Clara too little, but by giving her everything too easily. The pain of this realization was profound, a deeper wound than any public humiliation. It was the quiet, devastating grief of a parent recognizing a stranger in their own child. As the first pale fingers of dawn began to streak the sky, a calm settled over him. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind not ash, but steel. His course was clear. This was no longer about personal pain or a wounded ego. It was about responsibility. Love wasn't about unconditional provision. Sometimes it was about enforcing a necessary, albeit painful, lesson. He looked at the picture of Eleanor, her smiling face a beacon in the dim light. "I'm sorry, honey," he whispered, his voice thick with a sorrow that felt ancient. "I tried to protect her from the world. Now I have to protect our legacy from her." He picked up the phone from its cradle and dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice. "David," he said, his voice steady and resolved. "It's time." The morning light that filled Arthur's office was cool and clinical, a stark contrast to the emotional storm of the previous night. The decision, once made, had settled into a heavy, unyielding calm. David Chen sat opposite him, a folder resting untouched on his lap. They had been partners for decades, first in the trenches of rebuilding the company, and now as silent custodians of its truth. There was no need for lengthy discussion. The gravity of the situation was understood in the quiet space between them. Arthur felt not a thrill of impending victory, but the solemn weight of a surgeon about to make a necessary, painful incision. This was not about revenge. It was a course correction. "Do it," Arthur said, his voice even. It wasn't a question or a command, but a simple statement of fact. David nodded once, his expression impassive. He stood, and without another word, left Arthur alone with the rising sun. Back in his own minimalist office on the top floor of the Vance Logistics Tower, David Chen moved with the unhurried efficiency that defined him. He opened his laptop, the plan already a sequence of precise interlocking steps in his mind. First, the email. The language had to be perfect. Cold, corporate, and utterly final. To Marcus Smith, from David Chen, Chairman. Subject: important notification regarding your employment. Marcus, due to a strategic and unscheduled restructuring of our executive team, a number of positions have been reassessed. It is with regret that I must inform you that your role as Senior Vice President of Business Development has been eliminated, effective immediately. Further details regarding severance and the transition process will be provided by HR. We thank you for your contributions. As his finger hovered over the send button, he placed 2 other calls. The first was to the head of IT. Deactivate Marcus Smith's network access. All accounts. Now. The second was to the Chief Financial Officer. Cancel corporate cards issued to Marcus Smith. All of them. Effective immediately. He then sent a secure message to the head of company security. Retrieve asset TX78. Be a Mercedes S-Class from Marcus Smith. He clicked send. A multi-front, synchronized attack executed in less than 90 seconds. In his sun-drenched penthouse overlooking the city, Marcus Smith was feeling magnanimous. The Patek Philippe felt heavy and significant on his wrist. Last night had been a triumph. Clara was still asleep, a beautiful sculpture in a sea of white linen. He poured himself a cup of coffee from his high-end Swiss machine and sat down at his glass desk to scan his emails. A king surveying his domain. He saw the subject line from David Chen and smiled, assuming it was a note of congratulations for the party, perhaps even a hint at a larger bonus. He read the first sentence, and the smile faltered. He read it again. The words seemed to warp, refusing to make sense. Restructuring, eliminated, effective immediately. A cold dread, entirely foreign to him, washed over his body. This was a mistake, a typo, some bizarre company-wide HR blunder. He tried to log into his company portal. Access denied. Panic, hot and sharp, pierced his confusion. He snatched his phone and frantically scrolled to his contacts, finding the private number for John Devereaux, a man he considered an ally on the board. It went straight to voicemail. "John, it's Marcus," he said, his voice tight and strained. "What the hell is going on? I just got a layoff email. This is definitely a mistake, a huge mistake. Call me back right now." He hung up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to get to headquarters, had to sort this out face to face. He opened a travel app on his phone to book an emergency first-class flight. He entered the details of his corporate American Express, the black card that had been his key to the world. He hit purchase. A red notification flashed on the screen. Card declined. Before he could even process this new indignity, the intercom buzzed. It was the front desk. "Mr. Smith? Apologies for the early call." The doorman's voice was politely detached. "Vance Logistics Security just called. They've dispatched a team to retrieve your company Mercedes from the garage. Is there a problem?" Marcus stood frozen in the middle of his living room, the phone slipping from his suddenly slick hand. His job, his access, his credit card, his car. In the space of 5 minutes, the entire scaffolding of the life he had so proudly claimed as his own creation had been systematically dismantled. He was in free fall, and he had no idea who had cut the rope. From his silent office across town, Arthur watched the sun climb higher in the sky. His phone set to silent. lit up with a series of frantic, blocked calls he knew were from Marcus. He let them go unanswered. The first domino had fallen. Marcus was out of a job, but he still didn't understand who pushed it. He'll find out soon enough. The phone on the vast, uncluttered expanse of Arthur's mahogany desk remained silent. It was the only object in the room that seemed to hold any tension. The city outside the panoramic window moved with its usual relentless, indifferent rhythm, a river of yellow taxis flowing downtown, plumes of white steam rising from unseen vents, a silent ballet of commerce and life. Inside the office, the atmosphere was as still and quiet as a held breath. A fire whispered in the grate, its warmth a stark contrast to the cool, clinical precision of the room. David Chen stood near the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, his hands clasped behind his back, a silent partner in this final, painful phase of the operation. There was no need for words between them. They had spent decades communicating in the shared language of strategy, risk, and consequence. This was simply the endgame. Arthur wasn't nervous. The emotional storm had passed during the long, sleepless night. What remained was a cold, hard sense of purpose, the dispassionate resolve of a surgeon about to excise a sickness. Yet, beneath the calm, a low, thrumming current of sorrow persisted. He was not just a CEO executing a hostile takeover of a life. He was a father, and this was a form of amputation. He was waiting for the inevitable, for the shriek of pain that would signal the procedure had begun. Then, it rang. The sound was a violent intrusion, a shrill, digital scream that tore through the tranquility. The screen lit up with a single word, glowing with an almost accusatory brightness. Clara. Arthur looked at it, his expression unreadable. He let it ring once, the sound echoing the frantic panic he knew was on the other end of the line. He let it ring twice, a deliberate, measured pause. This was not a call to be answered with haste. It was a summons to be accepted on his own terms. On the third ring, he calmly reached out a hand, the movement slow and unhurried. He pressed the answer button and then tapped the small speakerphone icon. A tiny green light blinked on, an unblinking eye in the center of the room. David, from his position by the bookshelf, did not move, but his posture seemed to tighten by a fraction of an inch. The first sound was not a word, but a raw, ragged gasp for air. The sound of a person who had been running or screaming or both. It was followed by a torrent of fury, a voice he recognized, yet warped by a pitch of hysteria he had never heard before. "Dad, what did you do?" Clara's voice was a blade, sharp and serrated with panic and rage. "What did you do?" Marcus lost his job. They fired him in an email, like he was some intern. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? Why didn't you do something? You have contacts. You know John Devereux on the board. You've known him for years. Why didn't you call them? Why didn't you stop this? Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, the material groaning softly. He steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. He let her tirade wash over him, a wave of incoherent rage. He listened to every word, every accusation, every desperate, entitled plea. He was dissecting it, not as a father, but as an analyst, noting the key points of her argument, the injustice, the humiliation, the absolute assumption that he possessed both the power and the obligation to intervene. When she finally paused to draw another ragged breath, he spoke. His voice, when it came, was so devoid of emotion, so eerily quiet, that it seemed to absorb all the frantic energy she had thrown into the room. "I heard there was a restructuring." The sheer, infuriating calmness of his response seemed to rob her of speech for a moment. He could hear her sharp, incredulous intake of air over the speaker. "Restructuring?" she finally shrieked, the word cracking under the strain. "A restructuring? They destroyed him. They canceled everything. The corporate cards, the car allowance, the doorman just called. Dad, they sent a team to repossess the Mercedes. From our garage. How are we supposed to live? How am I supposed to pay for anything? You have to fix this. This is your mess to clean up. You OWE us that." The final words, "You owe us that," hung in the air. a perfect crystallization of the disease he was trying to cure. The sense of entitlement was so profound, so deeply and honestly held, that it almost defied belief. He let her declaration settle, letting the silence stretch into an uncomfortable, yawning chasm. Over the phone line, he could hear her breathing, ragged and impatient, waiting for his capitulation. Finally, he spoke again, his tone still unnervingly quiet, as if he were discussing a minor point in a contract. "Clara," he said, and the simple, calm use of her name seemed to momentarily disarm her. "Last night, at the party, you were sitting at the table next to your friend, Caroline." There was a confused pause on the other end. "What?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion and frustration. "What does last night have to do with anything?" "You said something," Arthur continued, his voice methodical, as if he were reading from a transcript. "Caroline asked you if you had a gift for me, and you laughed. You waved your hand in my direction and you said, 'Oh, that old man doesn't get anything.'" He paused, letting the first quote land with the weight of a stone. "And then you added, 'Besides, he doesn't contribute anything.'" Clara was stunned into a momentary, breathless silence. He had repeated her words verbatim, his memory a perfect code recording of her casual cruelty. What? That was just a joke. I was talking to a friend. It was party talk." "No," Arthur said, and for the first time, a sliver of ice entered his voice, sharp and lethal. "It wasn't a joke, Clara. It was a verdict. It was the truth as you see it. And after a great deal of thought, I have decided to accept your truth. You're right. I'm just an old man who contributes nothing. So, you see, I have nothing to give. I have no influence to peddle, no power to wield. I have no cause to make, because, as you so clearly pointed out, I am worthless." He could hear her sharp, panicked breathing, the frantic whirring of a mind that could not process what was happening. Her entire worldview, built on a foundation of his silent, limitless support, was being dismantled with her own words. "That's insane. That's not what I meant, and you know it. You're my father," she cried, her voice losing its anger and taking on the desperate, pleading tone of a child. "And last night," Arthur pressed on, his voice now as cold and hard as steel, "you gave a very expensive gift to your husband. You stood up in front of everyone, and you called him your rock, your provider. You made your choice, your declaration of where your security and your future lie, very publicly. You drew a line in the sand, Clara." He let that sink in, the final, crucial piece of her own pronouncement. The silence on the other end of the line was louder than all her screaming had been. It was the sound of a life's assumptions crashing down. She didn't understand the mechanics of it, not yet, but she was beginning to feel the terrifying causal link between her own arrogance and the utter ruin she was now facing. She was beginning to be afraid, and that was the beginning of wisdom. "Now," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a final, chillingly calm tone that was more terrifying than any shout. "Your provider has nothing. Good luck, Clara." With a steady hand, he reached forward and pressed the end call button. The small green light on the speakerphone went dark. The connection was severed. The silence that flooded the room was absolute, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Arthur did not move. He sat there for a long moment, his hands still steepled, his gaze still fixed on the flames. The judge had passed sentence. The surgeon had made the final cut. There was no triumph in his posture, no satisfaction in his eyes. There was only the profound, solemn weight of a promise, finally, painfully, capped. He had done what needed to be done. The silence was not the sound of victory. It was the sound of a father grieving for the daughter he had to lose in order to save. In the days that followed the phone call, Arthur operated with a chilling detachment. He did not feel joy, only a grim sense of necessity. Each morning, David Chen would provide a brief, dispassionate report, a series of small, tactical updates in a campaign that was unfolding with devastating precision. The penthouse lease, held under Advanced Logistics corporate account, was terminated. Membership renewals at their exclusive country club and various city lounges were quietly declined. The invisible, intricate web of financial support that had cradled Clara's entire adult life was being systematically unraveled, thread by thread. The first public tremor of their collapsing world came not with a bang, but with a quiet, humiliating swipe of a credit card. Feeling frayed and seeking the hollow comfort of retail therapy, Clara swept into a Chanel boutique on Madison Avenue. The air was thick with the scent of leather and expensive perfume, a familiar and comforting atmosphere. She selected a classic quilted handbag, a balm for her fractured nerves, and presented her American Express Platinum card to the sales associate with the casual confidence of someone who has never had to consider a price tag. The associate, a woman with a professionally serene smile, swiped the card. A flicker of concern crossed her face. She swiped it again. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice a low, discreet murmur. "The card is not being accepted. Would you care to try another?" Clara's blood ran cold. "That's impossible," she said, her own voice a strained whisper, acutely aware of the other wealthy patrons gliding through the boutique. "There must be a mistake." "Swipe it again?" The associate complied, her expression now one of polite pity. She shook her head. "I'm very sorry, ma'am." Clara fled the store, the chic handbag left abandoned on the glass counter, her face burning with a shame she had never before experienced. Later, David recounted the incident to Arthur, his voice flat. "The AMX Platinum. You co-signed for her when she was in college with Van's assets as the guarantor. I had legal notify the bank that the guarantee was withdrawn. They immediately froze the account to mitigate their risk." Arthur simply nodded. "That card I opened for her when she went to college. Her line of credit was backed by Van's logistics assets. She never knew that. She just thought she qualified. Now she's learning a hard lesson about qualifications." The true crisis arrived a day later, in a crisp, formal envelope slid under the door of their penthouse. It was an eviction notice. They had 30 days to vacate the premises. The illusion of their sun-drenched paradise shattered, revealing it for what it was. A gilded cage they no longer had the key to. The expensive furniture, once a source of pride, now seemed to mock them. A small pile of declined payment notices and overdue bills lay accusingly on the marble console table. The pressure finally cracked the perfect facade of their marriage. "What are we gonna do?" Marcus demanded, pacing the vast living room like a trapped animal. His tailor suit seemed to hang on him differently now, a costume from a play that had abruptly closed. The rent, the car payment, everything was in my name, covered by the company. Clara, who had been staring out at the city skyline with unseeing eyes, turned to him, her face a mask of stubborn denial. "My dad will handle it," she insisted, her voice brittle. "He's just upset. He's just trying to teach us a lesson. He won't let his only daughter be thrown out on the street." Marcus let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "Are you sure about that?" he sneered, the last of his charm stripped away by fear. "Are you really? After what you said at the party? You didn't just burn that bridge, Clara. You nuked it from orbit." "Don't you dare blame this on me," she shrieked, the carefully constructed composure of her life finally crumbling into raw, ugly panic. "You're the one who got fired. You're the one who wasn't smart enough to keep his job. This is your fault." Marcus whirled on her, his face contorted with a rage born of pure terror. "My fault? My fault? I was the golden boy. And then you stood up and publicly insulted the one man who could have helped us. You insulted that old man, and now look at us." The silence that followed their shouting was heavy and suffocating. For the first time, they were no longer a perfect couple, united against the world. They were just two frightened people in a shrinking gilded cage, turning on each other because the real enemy was a force they couldn't comprehend. In that quiet, terrifying moment, as she looked at the panicked stranger her husband had become, a question, small and insidious, began to form in Clara's mind. She thought back over her life, a seamless existence of effortless acquisition and unquestioned privilege. How had it all been so easy? The answer had always been simple: because she deserved it. For the first time, a sliver of doubt, cold and terrifying, suggested that might not be the whole story. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking. like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you? And where are you listening? Backed into a corner for the first time in his life, Marcus reacted not with introspection, but with a surge of indignant determination. This wasn't a consequence, it was a conspiracy. Convinced that his dismissal was a political maneuver by a jealous rival, he set about using his network to uncover the truth. The first day was a flurry of confident calls to former colleagues and supposed allies. The responses were a chillingly uniform wall of silence. Voicemails went unreturned. Text messages were met with terse, evasive replies. The world that had once eagerly answered his calls now pretended it couldn't hear him ringing. Desperate, he arranged to meet a former colleague, Tom, for a drink. He chose an upscale bar in the financial district, a dark, wood-paneled institution, where he had celebrated the closing of the Apex contract. He hoped the familiar territory would loosen Tom's tongue. "You have to know something, Tom," Marcus said, leaning forward, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. He was trying to project an image of a man in control, a player navigating a temporary setback. "Nobody fires a top performer like me without a reason. Was it David Chen? That old man has always been jealous of me. Ever since Tom cut him off, his eyes darting nervously around the bar. He took a long swallow of his scotch and lowered his voice. "Listen to me, Marcus. I don't know anything. And if I did, I couldn't say." He leaned closer, the scent of fear and expensive liquor on his breath. "The orders came from the top. And I don't mean David Chen. I mean above the chairman. Nobody is asking questions, Marcus. Nobody. You need to let this go. You're poking something very, very big." The words hung in the air between them. Above the chairman. The concept was nonsensical to Marcus. David Chen was atop. There was nothing above him but a ghost, a retired founder who hadn't been seen in years. A wave of paranoia, cold and unsettling, washed over him. This wasn't a simple corporate backstabbing. It was something else entirely. While Marcus was hitting a wall of silence, Clara was facing a wall of impending poverty. Her panic, initially a hot, raging fire, had cooled into a desperate, gnawing anxiety. Her father wasn't answering her calls. Her credit cards were useless. The eviction notice felt like a ticking time bomb. Driven by a primal need for financial survival, she turned her attention to the one safety net she believed she had, Grandpa's old trust fund. She had never paid it any mind, simply accepting the generous monthly allowance it provided as her birthright. Now, she needed more. She needed to find a way to access the principal. She began a frantic search, tearing through the pristine, rarely opened filing cabinets in their home office. She was looking for bank statements, for legal documents, for the name of a lawyer she could call and beg. At the bottom of a dusty box filled with old college memorabilia, she found a worn leather portfolio. Inside were documents related to the trust, but they were not what she expected. The reports were vague, the statements minimal. The fund, she discovered, was managed by a small, obscure law firm she had never heard of. It all felt thin, too simple for the kind of money she had always assumed was behind her lifestyle. Then she found another file tucked away in the very back of the portfolio. It was thinner, older, the label written in her mother's elegant cursive, Eleanor Vance Trust. Curiosity piqued. She opened it. Inside were not glossy brochures from a wealth management firm, but dry, corporate-looking financial statements from the early 2000s. And then she saw it. A line item, repeated on every page. Annual disbursement funded by parent entity, Vance Logistics. Her breath caught in her chest. Vance Logistics. The name of the mid-sized company that Marcus had been fighting his way through. The company that had just fired her husband and destroyed their lives. She felt a sudden, dizzying wave of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. The coincidence was too great, too specific, too terrifying to ignore. It wasn't Grandpa's old money. It was something else, something connected to her mother, and to the very company that was now the source of all their misery. 100 small, disconnected memories suddenly clicked into place. Her father's quiet, unassuming life, his strangely detailed knowledge of shipping routes she'd once dismissed as a boring hobby, The way David Chen always treated him with a deference that bordered on reverence. A new, horrifying narrative was beginning to take shape, and at its center was the one person she had so casually dismissed. The old man who contributes nothing. Clara arrived at his house unannounced, pushing past the housekeeper with a wild, haunted look in her eyes. She wasn't wearing the armor of Chanel or the polished confidence he was used to. She looked stripped down, raw, her face pale, and her hair slightly disheveled. She clutched a worn leather portfolio to her chest like a shield. He was in the living room, a cozy space with a crackling fire, surrounded by a lifetime of books and memories. It was the heart of the home he had built with Eleanor, a place of warmth and quiet stability, a stark contrast to the storm that had just walked through the door. She didn't waste time on greetings. She marched to the tea coffee table, a piece he had painstakingly crafted with his own hands years ago, and threw the folder down. The slap of leather on wood echoed in the quiet room. "Vance Logistics," she said, her voice shaking with a potent cocktail of anger and fear. "It's everywhere. It's in Mom's trust documents. It's in the old financial statements. Why is the company that just ruined our lives tangled up with our family's money?" Arthur looked away from his daughter's accusing gaze and stared into the dancing flames of the fire. He felt a profound, bone-deep weariness. The time for secrets was over. "Because it isn't tangled up with the family money, Clara," he said, his voice calm and even. "It is the family money." She stared at him, bewildered. "I don't understand." "Sit down, Clara." His voice was gentle, but it held an undeniable weight of command. She hesitated, then sank into the armchair opposite him, the one that had been her mother's favorite. "It's time I told you a story. A story about your grandfather, about your mother, and about the price of a promise." He began to speak, his voice a low, steady cadence against the crackle of the fire. He told her about her grandfather, a charming man who was a visionary in his youth, but a disastrously sentimental businessman in his later years. He explained how Vance Logistics, once a proud local company, had been driven to the very brink of bankruptcy, crippled by debt and outdated practices. "When your mother got sick," he continued, his gaze still fixed on the fire, as if seeing the past in the flames, she knew the company was failing. It broke her heart. Her greatest fear was that you would be left with nothing, that you would have to struggle. In her last days, she made me promise. "Protect our girl Arthur," she said. "Give her the world, but don't let the world break her." "I promise I would." He finally turned to look at Clara. Her face was a canvas of confusion, the anger beginning to recede, replaced by dawning, fearful curiosity. "So I took over," he said simply. "I stepped in after your grandfather passed. I worked day and night. I remortgaged this house. I took risks that would have terrified him. I rebuilt it, piece by piece, from the inside out. I kept it a secret because I was trying to keep my promise. I wanted you to have a normal life, free from the pressure of that legacy. I appointed David Chen to be the public face so I could remain in the shadows, to be your father, not your boss." He leaned forward, the full weight of his next words intended to land with surgical precision. "The man you call that old man, the one who contributes nothing, is the founder, owner, and silent CEO of Vance Logistics." The color drained from Clara's face. She looked as though he had struck her. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "The trust fund your grandfather left was nearly worthless by the time he died." Arthur went on, his voice relentless but devoid of malice. "The allowance you receive every month, the money that paid for your Ivy League education, your summers in Europe, the down payment on your first apartment, it all came from the profits of the company I rebuilt. The penthouse you live in is on a corporate lease that I approved. The credit card that was declined at Chanel was backed by company assets that I control. The Patek Philippe watch you gave your provider. You bought it with my money, Clara. You gave him a gift from me." He finished speaking, and the silence that descended was absolute. It was heavier and more profound than any of her screams on the phone. Clara just sat there, motionless, the folder on the table forgotten. Her entire life, every accomplishment she had claimed, every luxury she had deemed her birthright, was a lie. The carefully constructed edifice of her identity had been demolished, brick by brick, by the quiet, devastating truth. When I finished, she just sat there, motionless. The curtain had been pulled back, and the monster she feared wasn't some evil CEO. It was the truth about herself. Now you understand, I said gently. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The drive back to the penthouse was a journey through a foreign country. The familiar streets of the city, the towering glass buildings, the river gleaming in the afternoon sun, it was all a backdrop to a film she was no longer a part of. She felt hollowed out, a fragile shell of a person, the echoes of her father's story ricocheting in the empty space where her identity used to be. Every landmark was a monument to a lie. The gallery where she'd bought a painting with her allowance, the restaurant where Marcus had celebrated a deal her father had secretly orchestrated, the very streets paved by an empire she had never seen. When she arrived, the key felt alien in her hand. The heavy, ornate door to the penthouse, once a symbol of arrival and success, now felt like the entrance to a tomb. Inside, the scene was even more jarring. Over the past few days, a quiet, orderly chaos had begun. Much of their furniture was shrouded in white dust cloths, standing in the cavernous living room like a congregation of ghosts. Half-packed boxes were stacked against the walls, labeled with a neat, impersonal script by the moving company they could no longer afford. It was a space in the process of being unmade, a life being methodically erased. Marcus was there, pacing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, a caged animal waiting for his keeper. He stopped when he saw her, his face a mask of anxious hope. He was looking for a reprieve, for news that her father had relented, that the nightmare was over. He saw her expression, and his face fell. "Well?" he demanded, his voice tight. "Did you fix it? Is he going to make the calls?" Clara walked slowly to the center of the room, the leather portfolio from her father's house still clutched in her hand. She let it drop onto a shrouded sofa. She didn't have the energy for anger, or even for tears. All she had left was the stark, desolate weight of the truth. "It's over, Marcus," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She finally looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a partner, but a co-conspirator in her own delusion. There are no calls to make. He's not gonna fix it. What are you talking about? Of course, he can fix it. No, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength from the sheer finality of it all. You don't understand. My grandfather's trust. It was basically worthless. The money, Marcus. All of it. For years. The allowance, this apartment, the trips, the cars, it all came from Vance Logistics. Marcus stared at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. From the company? How? As some kind of executive perk? She shook her head, a slow, painful motion. No, not as a perk, as an owner's distribution. My father, he isn't just some retired advisor. He's been the sole owner, the CEO, this whole time. He rebuilt the company from nothing after my grandfather nearly ran it into the ground. He's been running everything from the shadows for years. The color drained from Marcus's face. He stood frozen for a long moment, the pieces clicking into place in his mind with audible, shattering force. The quiet, unassuming old man, the inexplicable deference from David Chen, the sudden, ruthlessly efficient termination. He began to pace again, but this time it was different. It was the frantic energy of a rat realizing the maze has no exit. So everything, he said, the words choked with a dawning, horrified rage. All of it is his. My job, this apartment, our life. It's all just some show he set up. It's... Clara's voice was weak, clinging to the last vestiges of her old reality. It's my family's money. A sound escaped Marcus's throat, a wild, hysterical bark that was meant to be a laugh. It echoed unnervingly in the high-ceilinged, empty room. Your family? He roared, wording on her, his face a twisted mask of betrayal and fury. No, Clara. It's HIS money. Not yours, not ours. His! And you threw it all away. You stood there in front of everyone and you insulted the man who holds the strings to the entire damn puppet show. He advanced on her, his voice dripping with a venom she had never heard. The final mask of the charming, ambitious husband dissolving to reveal the ruthless opportunist beneath. You're not just stupid, you're a liability, a burden. I married you because I thought you were smart, because I thought you came from something, that you had a future. Turns out, you just have a subsidized past. The words struck her with more force than a physical blow. She staggered back, the accusation of being a burden, a perfect, cruel echo of her own words about her father. Marcus wasn't finished. He stormed into their bedroom and emerged a moment later, pulling a single, perfectly packed suitcase. It was the one he always kept ready for business trips. He didn't even break his stride as he headed for the door, his face a mask of cold fury. He was cutting his losses, abandoning the sinking ship with a rat's instinct for self-preservation. He paused at the door, turning to look at her one last time, his eyes holding nothing but contempt. "I'm done," he said, the words sharp and final. "I'm not going down with you. Good luck with your empty legacy." The door clicked shut behind him, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent, ghostly room. The silence he left behind was a physical presence. It pressed in on her from all sides, suffocating and absolute. The betrayal was so complete, so profound. It went beyond pain and into a strange, cold numbness. He hadn't loved her. He had loved what she represented, and the moment that representation was revealed as a fraud, so was he. She sank down onto one of the half-packed boxes, the rough cardboard biting into her legs. She looked around the cavernous room, at the shrouded furniture, and the empty spaces where their life used to be. The afternoon sun streamed through the vast windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, tiny particles in a world that had suddenly become immense and terrifying. For the first time in her life, Clara was completely alone. No money, no husband, no life to cling to. She was nothing but the sum of her mistakes, sitting in the ruins of a paper kingdom. There was no one to call, no one to blame, no one to rescue her. She could stay on this box and let the silence swallow her whole. She could fall, or she could stand up. It was the first real choice of her life. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past without clicking. Like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second, what time is it for you, and where are you listening? The autumn of scorched earth bled into the long, quiet stillness of winter. The months that followed the great unraveling were not marked by triumph for Arthur, but by a profound and unsettling silence. The victory, so ruthlessly and efficiently executed, had left a vacuum in its wake. He had won the war for his legacy, but the peace felt unnervingly like loneliness. His sprawling home, once a sanctuary, now felt cavernous, its rooms echoing with the ghosts of conversations that had never happened, of a family life he had kept shielded and separate for so long that it had become brittle, then shattered. His days fell into a placid, unvarying routine. He would wake before dawn, make his own coffee, and sit in the quiet of the living room, watching the pale winter light creep over the manicured lawns. He spent hours in the greenhouse Eleanor had so meticulously designed, tending to her dormant orchids, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and memory. His daily call with David Chen became even more perfunctory, a brief exchange of market positions and corporate oversight, the business of his empire, a distant hum, a machine that no longer required his hands on the controls. He had expected to feel vindicated. Instead, he felt the heavy weight of his final question to Clara. What are you going to do about it? The question had hung in the air between them, and it now hung over his own life. He had torn down the elaborate stage, ripped away the script, and sent the actors into the wilderness. He had done it to keep his promise to Eleanor, to protect what they had built. But as he looked at her smiling photograph on his desk, a cold dread sometimes crept into his heart. Had he protected her legacy only to break their daughter? Had he saved her soul by destroying her life? He had no way of knowing. There had been no calls, no angry messages, no intermediaries pleading her case. There had been nothing but silence. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slick with rain and tucked between a glossy catalog and a property tax bill. The envelope was a simple, inexpensive cream stock, a stark contrast to the heavy, embossed stationery Clara had always favored. Her name wasn't on the return address, just a street he didn't recognize from a neighborhood across town. But the handwriting was hers, instantly recognizable, though it lacked its former confident, flamboyant loops. It was smaller, more deliberate, as if each letter had been formed with conscious effort. He carried it into his office, the weight of the small envelope feeling immense in his hand. The rain pattered against the large window pane, a gentle, melancholic rhythm that matched the slow, heavy beat of his own heart. This was it, the verdict on the most difficult and cruelest decision of his life. He sat in his heavy leather chair and looked at the envelope for a long time, a silent prayer forming on his lips, not for forgiveness, but for a sign that she had survived. Finally, with a steady hand, he picked up the silver letter opener, a long-ago gift from Eleanor, and slit the seal. The paper inside was thin, and the message was written on a single page. Dad. The simple salutation sent a jolt through him. Not father, her formal address when she was displeased, nor the petulant daddy of her youth. Just Dad. I'm not writing to ask for anything. I just wanted you to know. He paused. A breath he hadn't realized he was holding escaping his lips in a long, slow sigh. It was the first and most important test. The absence of a request was, in itself, the entire message. He continued reading, his eyes scanning the careful script. I have a job. I work at a small art gallery downtown, in the warehouse district. It's mostly packing and inventory, a little bit of sales. The pay isn't great, but the owner lets me listen to the art history lectures on the computer when it's slow. There's a constant smell of turpentine and old canvas that I've come to like. He could picture it. Not the gleaming, white-walled galleries she used to frequent as a patron, but a place with concrete floors and exposed pipes. A place of work, not of leisure. He thought of Eleanor's love for art, the quiet joy she took in discovering a new painter. The connection was a bittersweet pang in his chest. I live in a small apartment over a bakery. The faucet in the bathroom drips, and I can hear my neighbor's television through the wall. But in the morning, the whole place smells like fresh bread. I paid my own rent this month. I wrote the check myself and put it in the landlord's hand. It felt solid, real. More real than anything in that penthouse ever did. A slow, unfamiliar warmth began to spread through his chest, thawing an icy knot of grief and guilt he hadn't realized was lodged so deeply within him. The pride that washed over him was a quiet, powerful tide, more profound than the thrill of any billion-dollar acquisition or successful hostile takeover. This was it. This was a true profit margin, the ultimate return on investment. I've been thinking a lot about what you did. Not about the taking away, but about the giving. All those years of it. An endless, invisible river that I never even saw. I just complained when the tide wasn't high enough. I'm sorry I couldn't see it. I'm sorry for the things I said and for the person I was. I don't think that girl lives here anymore. Thank you for everything. Even for this hardest lesson, your daughter, Clara. He read the letter once, then twice, then a third time, the words blurring slightly through the film of moisture that had gathered in his eyes. He slowly, carefully folded the single sheet of paper and placed it on the polished mahogany of his desk, right beside Eleanor's photograph, as if it were an offering. He leaned back in his chair and looked from the smiling face in the silver frame to the simple, heartfelt words on the page. He had not broken his promise. He had fulfilled it in the only way that truly mattered. He had not protected her from the world. He had given her the strength to face it. His legacy wasn't the towering headquarters of Vance Logistics. It was this new, resilient young woman living in a small apartment over a bakery, finding pride in a paycheck and peace in the scent of fresh bread. The rain outside had stopped. A pale, watery sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. The waiting was over. The silence had been filled not with pleas or recriminations, but with the quiet, sturdy sound of a life being rebuilt. He picked up the phone, his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't call the number for the art gallery. He didn't call Clara. It was too soon. Her new world was still fragile, a seedling pushing its way through concrete. It needed to grow on its own, without the shadow of his influence. Instead, He dialed the direct line to his most trusted colleague. David, he said, his voice clear and steady, devoid of the weariness that had clung to it for months. I need you to do something for me. Set up a new foundation, a private one. Call it the Eleanor Vance Startup Fund. Capitalize it however you see fit. I want it to be an incubator for small businesses, particularly in the arts. He paused, looking at his daughter's letter, at his wife's smiling face. And David, he added, a hint of a smile in his own voice for the first time in a long time. Draft the charter so that the primary seat on the board of directors is reserved for Clara Vance. Don't tell her about it. Just let it sit there, managed by the lawyers. When she's ready, she'll find it.